Okay, hi everyone. This is the lecture on chapter 15, which is Darwin and evolution. And so this is the first chapter in a new unit, right? And the new unit is basically evolution, all right? So both in terms of the chapters we're covering in Bio 111 in this semester, it will be this chapter 15, and then the last chapter will be 16. And then we continue with the evolution theme in Fundamentals of Biology 2 or Bio 113. Okay, so again, we're sort of switching gears from what we talked about in chapter 12, which was really molecular biology. Okay, so in terms of what we're going to cover in this chapter, history of evolutionary thought, talking about, again, we're going to talk about Darwin, but we're also going to talk about some scientists that were around kind of during his time and what their thoughts were and what sort of the thoughts and the beliefs were at that time. And then we'll particularly, like I said, focus on Darwin's theory of evolution, and then talk a little bit about some things that have provided evidence for evolution and basically evidence for natural selection, and the theory of evolution that Darwin proposed, and the theory of evolution that is widely accepted today based on Darwin's work and also based on the work of many, many other scientists over many, many years. Okay. So like I said, we'll first sort of start talking about just different thoughts on evolution that were present during Darwin's time and maybe right before his time. So the first part of this talks about prior to Darwin, right? So before his time, it says the view of nature was determined by deep-seated beliefs, right? And a lot of them were religious beliefs. And they basically had these beliefs and they believed they were true. And they weren't based on experimentation or observation, right? They were just beliefs that were there because somebody, their parents or whatever told them that these are the beliefs that you should, or these are the things you should believe. And also everyone around in them and in the rest of society believe these things. Okay. However, biologists started to slowly sort of accept some different ideas, right, of evolution. And again, this was based on observation, right, and experimentation. Okay, so the idea of evolution is just that species change through time. Okay, so evolution is now the unifying principle of biology. So as I said, we're going to talk about Darwin's work, but basically that theory of evolution is widely accepted, and it's considered a unifying principle of biology. And so it explains the unity and also the diversity of life, right? So basically similarities that you see between different living things reflect a common ancestor, right? The dissimilarities or differences between living things that can be observed reflect more ancient common ancestry. Okay. So the bottom line is that all living things had stemmed from a common ancestor at one point. Okay. Those that look more different from each other, they have a much more ancient ancestor. Those that look more similar or behave more similarly will have a more recent common ancestor. Okay. All right. So in terms of some of the scientists that were around at the time of Darwin and people that influenced his beliefs and basically his theory of evolution. So if we go sort of in chronological order, right? So mid-18th century, first person we're going to talk about is Linnaeus. Okay, so he's named the sort of father of taxonomy. Okay, so it says taxonomy matured during the mid-18th century. So taxonomy is basically the naming of and classification of living things, right? And so he developed this. Linnaeus, though, believed in something called the fixity of the species. Okay, so each species had an ideal structure and function and had a specific sort of place in sort of life in nature. And that was it. Those species were placed there and they stayed there, and that's it. And that's why we see all these different species. Okay. But again, what he's most known for is developing this naming and classification system for living things, right? So this binomial system of nomenclature, in terms of naming, right? We talk about the genus and the species, right? Naming living things, and then also classifying them, okay? So that's really his major contribution. But this belief of the fixity of species is also a belief that other scientists shared at the time as well, okay? He's a French naturalist that was around at the time, again, mid-18th century, Count Buffon. He wrote a 44-volume catalog of basically all the known plants and animals at that time, okay? And his work and what he observed and what he wrote about provided evidence of something called descent with modification, okay? So now this is kind of starting to suggest, slow changes, right? So he suggests things that there were mechanisms like environmental influences or movement like migration, geographic isolation, struggle for existence, all that these things could all modify species, right? And lead to sort of kind of getting at the idea of sort of adaptations, okay? All right. So he was kind of, I guess one of the first ones to sort of suggest some of this. Again, like I said, a lot of the scientists or just people in general at the time believed in this fixity of species, that those species were just placed there and that's why they're there, right? Okay, he started to suggest that perhaps there was something that was influencing these species and what type of species might be in a given area. Okay, Cuvier is now late 18th century, so a few years later, right? He was the first to use comparative anatomy to develop a system of classifying animals, okay? So again, Linnaeus really set up the sort of classification system in terms of setting up the naming system. Cuvier was the first one that really used comparative anatomy to really be able to classify those animals in a little bit of a more specific way. And he founded the science of paleontology, okay? And so we know that paleontologists study fossils, right? And can study the structure of those fossils to learn about species that were around a long time ago. So he proposed something called catastrophism. And what this was, and you, by the way, should be able to define a term like catastrophism, right? What does that mean? And basically it means what it says, okay? That local catastrophes in the past would basically, meaning like floods or some sort of, you want to think about a weather-related type of catastrophe, would basically cause the earth to have a new mix of fossils, right? And so basically the catastrophe would wipe out all of the living things that were there, and then that region would be repopulated by species from surrounding areas. And that's why you sort of saw this sort of change in species over time, because it was the result of these catastrophes, I can't even say it, catastrophes that occurred. Okay, so it wasn't this, it's more of the idea that it wasn't this slow, gradual change that basically, that the environment might cause, right, by natural selection or these kind of small, subtle adaptations that would occur. It was a catastrophe that would wipe out a whole bunch of species, and then those surrounding species would invade that area, and that's where the new species in that one given area came from, okay? All right, so moving on a little bit more in time. So late 18th century, early 19th century. First one to talk about was Lamarck. So he was actually the first biologist to really propose evolution, but he didn't get it quite right. He did link diversity with environmental adaptation, the idea that there are changes that are occurring in these living organisms because of the environment. But like I said, he didn't get it quite right. And I'll show you a picture that, sort of shows you Lamarck's sort of proposal, or his, I guess his kind of hypothesis, right, that he sort of proposed, and then also natural selection, which was proposed by Darwin on the other side of it. So we'll get to that in a second. But what he proposed was something called the inheritance of acquired characteristics, okay, or Lamarckianism, it's sometimes called. So like I said, a little bit more on that actual concept in a second, okay? So he was the first to propose evolution, but again, he didn't get it quite right, okay? So what he proposed was something called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And like I said, I have a picture or a figure to show you to explain that a little bit more on the next slide. Another sort of group here, so Lyell and Hutton, they basically wrote a book called Principles of Geology. And so what some of the ideas that were in this is that Earth is subject to slow, right, but continuous cycles of erosion and uplift. These aren't formed by catastrophes, right, which was proposed by Cuvier here, okay? So there's slow changes to the geography, right, to the Earth, and that then would influence the organisms that live there. Okay, so again, so these guys propose this slow, gradual change, which is sort of like this idea is the opposite of the catastrophism that we talked about before. Okay, so what he proposed, we can call that, or I'm sorry, both Lyell and Hutton proposed uniformitarianism. Okay, so rates and processes of change are constant and gradual. They're not sudden and catastrophic. Okay. Another important sort of person at the time, Malthus, was an economist, and he studied factors that influence the growth and the decline of human populations, right? So he was particularly looking at human populations, and he related famine, war, epidemics to the problem of populations outstretching their limited resources. Okay, so this sort of idea, it's sort of this sort of survival of the fittest type of idea, but looking at that human population. Okay, so it says Darwin used Malthus's principles to formulate his idea of natural selection. Okay, so I guess what sort of sets him apart is he sort of proposed natural selection, right? So think about survival of the fittest within the human population. Darwin focused on animal populations, right? As he went on his sort of voyage around the world, but the ideas he started got some ideas from Malthus. Okay, so like I said, I was going to show you a little bit more about Lamarck's idea, right? Which again, Lamarck is this inheritance of acquired characteristics compared to Darwin and natural selection. Okay, so we know that what actually is occurring based on Darwin's studies, and also based on many different studies that occurred following Darwin, right? Tons and tons of biological evidence. Okay, we know that over here is what is actually occurring. So if we look at the difference between the two here, let's look on this side first on Lamarck. Early giraffes probably had short necks that they stretched to reach the food, right? So here's your giraffes, they're shorter, have shorter necks, and they can't reach the food, right? So in order to reach the food, they would need to stretch their necks, okay? And so basically, kind of during their lifetime, their necks got longer, right? Because they had to stretch it. So, and so those necks were stretched to reach the food, and therefore they basically had offspring with longer necks, okay? Just because they, again, over their lifetime, stretched their necks to reach the food, okay? So it says, eventually the continued stretching of the neck led to today's giraffe. All right, well, that's not quite how it happens, okay? You know, a giraffe doesn't stretch its neck and then just because it stretches its neck have an offspring with a longer neck, okay? If we look at Darwin's theory of natural selection, right? Early giraffes probably had necks of various lengths, right? So they're going to start off where you have a population, really small population here, where some had short necks, some had long necks, okay? Only those with long necks could reach the leaves, right? Their food source. And therefore, unfortunately, what happened is those giraffes with the shorter necks died off, right? So again, this is survival of the fittest. These guys are the most fit for this environment because they can reach their food source, okay? The only ones that can produce offspring are those giraffes with longer necks, okay? So it says, eventually only long-necked giraffes survived the competition. Okay, so again, we know that this theory of natural selection, survival of the fittest, this is what in actuality, based on the scientific evidence that we have, this is the widely accepted theory of evolution, essentially. Okay, or of how think about how or the reason why we have so many different species, right? And species are so well suited for their environment, right? Based on natural selection, which is a slow, gradual process that happens over time. Okay. All right. So we've been talking about, Darwin, right, and his theory of evolution. We're going to talk more about that as we move through this chapter. But what this picture is just showing you a picture of Darwin here, showing you some of the animals that he saw along his voyage, tracing his voyage as well in terms of where he stopped. If you look here, this is basically showing you where he saw some of these. So both some of the geological features, right, the landscape, but also some of the living things that he saw as well. And so basically you can see where he found or saw some of these things here. Okay, so if you look at this marine iguana here, right, this was actually one of the species that he saw in the Galapagos. Okay, but he also studied the finches of the Galapagos and also the tortoises there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, so this isn't meant to memorize or anything like that. It's just meant to show you where this ship, the HMS Beagle, sailed, right? And so there you go. So the geological observations that he saw on his really long sort of voyage, right, and sort of diverse, right? He went to a lot of different parts of the world here, right? And so what he noticed in terms of geological observations, they were consistent with what Hutton and Lyell proposed, right? And so if we go back to Hutton and Lyell, right, they talked about this slow, continuous sort of cycles of erosion and uplift, right, and not these sudden catastrophic changes. Okay, but he did see a great deal of geological change depending on where he was or what location he was at, right? So for example, in Argentina, he saw raised beaches with these exposed layers of sediment that basically had a huge amount of fossils there, and he could actually see the diversity in terms of that sediment of that cliff, essentially, right? And how there's so much geological change throughout, right? And in fact, if you look at E, let me just double check where that's. Yeah, so E here is in the Andes Mountains, so we're here, right? This is sort of an example kind of showing you these massive layers or different layers of sediment that he saw, and in each one of these layers there's various different types of fossils that can be found. Okay, all right, so just kind of, and these aren't real pictures, obviously, they're just cartoon drawings here of some of these other types of mammals Darwin found during his exploration of South America. So and so it says, so basically there's fossils of these extinct animals that have been found subsequently. So this is a giant armadillo-like species here. This guy, he kind of looks like that, right? And then in B there, right, this Mylodon is actually a sort of giant sloth, right? So it's a giant ground sloth. Not going to be too good climbing trees if he's really big, right? And I think, how much does it say how much he weighed? No, but it does say that the this giant armadillo-like species here actually weighed about 2,000 kilograms. So big, right? So these were really big mammals that he saw. Okay, so like I said, he did really take a lot of or make a lot of observations about the geographic distribution of life forms on Earth, and really sort of matching up the animals or even plant life that he saw with the landscape, essentially, right? So we can kind of call this biogeography. Okay, so a study of the geographic distribution of life forms on Earth. And so that's how he was able to make, some of these proposals about the interaction between the living organisms and the environment, right? Because that's really what he was studying. So again, based on this, right, he saw similar species in similar habitats, right? And so based on that, he reasoned that related species could be modified according to the environment. So like I said, he traveled really large distances, but in areas, could be two really separate geographical areas. But if the habitat was similar, he would see similar animals there. So again, suggesting the environment had a lot of influence on the species that were able to live there. Okay. So it says living forms could be descended from extinct forms known only from the fossil record, obviously, right? If, he's looking at those current living species, he can't physically see their ancestors, right? Only from the fossil record. So for instance, right, he compared South American animals to those with which he was familiar with, right? From basically mainland, England, right? And so instead of rabbits, he found the Patagonian hare, right? So in the grasslands of South America, he saw this, he basically observed this Patagonian hare. It has long legs, and ears, but the face of a guinea pig, right? And so if you take a look at it, this is sort of, what he observed in South America, right? And he was comparing this to the rabbits this European hare that he was familiar with in his, where he lived, okay, where he was from. So some of the questions he sort of asked when he observed this, right? And he did this with other types of species as well, were like, did the Patagonian hare resemble a rabbit because the two types of animals were adapted to the same type of environment, right? They both ate grass, they both hid in bushes, they both moved rapidly using long hind legs. Did the Patagonian hare have the face of a guinea pig because it was a common descent with guinea pigs, right? So these are all sort of questions that he asked whenever he encountered any type of species, right? So again, he really observed traits of those living species and then observed what the environment was like, and then put those together. Okay. And again, did a lot of comparisons in terms of different areas that were similar in terms of environment. Now, the Galapagos Islands was one place where he spent a lot of time, right? And there were many different species that he focused on there. And so if we go back, right, we're talking about the Galapagos Island here. So I mentioned those marine iguanas were sort of one group of species that he looked at, but there were many, okay? So let's talk a little bit about that. And I mentioned the tortoises and the finches, right? So if you think about or hear about the Galapagos Islands, probably the first two species you might think of are the tortoises and the finches, okay? So one of the things he observed with the tortoises were that the neck length would vary, right, from island to island. So depending on the environment, he would see tortoises with longer necks or shorter necks. And so he proposed that speciation on the islands correlated with the difference in vegetation. Right? Makes sense. Kind of seems obvious now. But again, that's just because... Sorry. Okay. So as I was saying, sorry, I had to take a little pause there. Two of the main species that he spent a lot of time observing were tortoises and finches on the Galapagos Islands. And so as I mentioned, right, he noticed that the tortoise neck length would vary depending on what island he was on. Okay, and so he proposed that this correlated with the speciation, correlated with the differences in vegetation on the island. Okay, in terms of the finches, he observed that there were many different species of these finches on various islands, and he saw a significant variety in their beaks. Right, so different types of beak sizes and shapes. So one specific thing that he noticed were that ground-dwelling finches had beak adapted to eating seeds. Tree-dwelling finches had beak sized according to their insect prey. And I'll show you a picture of some of these beak differences in a second. And so the one thing that he also, so obviously the differences in the beak sizes and shapes was dependent on what their food source was, right? But he also speculated that these different species of finches that he saw could have descended from mainland finch species that he had also observed. Okay, so in terms of the tortoises, right, you can see that this tortoise here has a much longer neck compared to this one here, because on the island that this tortoise inhabited, right, the vegetation is much lower, as you can see. Here, there is not a lot of low-lying vegetation, right? So in order for the tortoise to be able to reach its food source, has to have a longer neck. Okay, again, some of this seems super obvious, right? Makes tons of sense, but none of this was really put together until Darwin spent the time really to observe the interaction between these species and the environment, right? And really think about the influence of the environment on different species. Okay, so in terms of his theory of evolution, right, Darwin's theory of evolution is natural selection, right, and adaptation. And so just to elaborate more on natural selection, right, members of a population have inheritable variations. Obviously, that's necessary, right? Even if we just think back to that giraffe example that I gave, right, where we had that picture of Lamarck's idea on one side and natural selection and Darwin on the other side, right? You have to have inheritable variations that exist. More individuals are produced in each generation than the environment can support, right? So those that are most fit for the environment are going to be the ones that survive. Those that are not will die, okay? And again, sort of along with that, organisms are always competing for available resources, okay? And again, some will survive, some will not. Those ones that survive have adaptive characteristics, okay? So favorable traits, right, that result in increased survival and reproduction, which causes organisms within a population to differ in their reproductive success. So again, those that are more suited for the environment will produce offspring, right, will have a higher reproductive success, and those will be the ones that over time will survive, okay? It says natural selection can result in a population adapted to conditions in the local environment as the environment changes. So the idea is the idea is kind of like you can have a larger sort of environmental so as that environment is changing, right, you may have a sort of smaller group of species or individuals that sort of form a specific population where you have these sort of adaptations that have already occurred. And as time goes on, right, and you have more and more generations produce, more and more of the species will have these favorable characteristics. And so then you wouldn't see this just a small population. You would see that basically, eventually pretty much all or most of the species will have those types of characteristics or adaptations, okay? All right. Some of the things that he emphasized, okay, in his theory of evolution is that individuals from a population will vary in functional characteristics, right, physical characteristics, and behavioral characteristics. So again, the idea is that it's not just, he wasn't just looking at physical traits, he was also looking at behavioral characteristics and other functional type of characteristics as well, okay? And he proposed that these variations that he saw, right, occurred randomly. And that those variations could be harmful, they could be helpful, or they could really have no effect at all, okay? So these variations that exist within a population are essentially random, right? They're just there because they're there due to genetic mutations, right? And then again, the environment will select for whatever variation, right? Or whatever adaptation is most suited for that environment, okay? So it says, these are essential to the natural selection process, just like I said. So if there was no variation to begin with, natural selection cannot occur. Again, remember that natural selection or the environment does not create mutations, right? Or variation. The variation is there beforehand, and that's what some of this is saying. The variation is there. The environment just selects for those variants, right? Or those individuals that have the variations that make them more successful, okay? So again, if there was no genetic variability, then there would be no natural selection, okay? So again, these variations allow adaptation to the environment to occur over time. And also, they can be passed from one generation to the next. They are heritable. That's super important as well. Okay, so I hope that this all makes sense, right? Again, some of this, as we're talking about it, sort of seems obvious probably, right? But again, not, it's not entirely, especially at his time. Oh, sorry. It's not obvious, right? And again, he put all of this together, and really, really came up with this theory of evolution that is still accepted today. Okay, so this is I always kind of laugh at this picture. It's kind of a silly picture. I probably can find a much better picture that displays variation in a population, right? So this is showing you variation in the human population, okay? And I'm not even sure that it is, right? Like I said, I could find a picture that has a lot more variation as well. And I could also show you a picture of different species, right? Not just human species. I think we can identify easily with the idea of variation within the human population, okay? All right. So again, continuing on with his theory of evolution, okay? And again, some of these things are a little redundant. I've sort of been talking about them as we move through. We're just, I guess, talking about them in a little more detail and adding a little bit more sort of vocabulary in the mix here, right? So, I said survival of the fittest, right? So the idea of fitness, okay? The idea of fitness is the relative reproductive success of an individual, okay? So again, this is survival of the fittest, right? The most fit individuals in a population, right? Says capture a disproportionate share of the resources. So they are going to consume more of the resources, okay? Because they are more fit to obtain those resources, okay? And so therefore the other individuals that are not as fit are not going to have access to those resources, and eventually, again, they will not survive, okay? So again, interactions with the environment determine which individuals reproduce the most, okay? This is an example here with rattlesnakes, okay? Western diamondback rattlesnakes, to be exact, living in a dark environment. Those that are most fit are black, right? But if you're talking about those that live in a lighter environment, those that are most fit are lighter in color, okay? So, I mean, again, kind of seems obvious, but or maybe doesn't, right? But so the idea is depending on what environment a species lives in, the environment is going to influence the traits that you will see in that species, okay? And that can change over time, and it does change over time. There's lots and lots of evidence, right, of evolution and this sort of change over time. But again, a species might be perfectly suited for an environment at one point. But again, once that environment changes, now that species must adapt to that changing environment. If that species does not adapt to that changing environment, it will die off, right? And again, we've seen that throughout evolution. If we study fossil records and study evolution. Okay, so I think that's pretty obvious. Background matching helps that animal avoid being captured, right? It can hide much easier. Okay, so again, in terms of specific sort of vocabulary, an adaptation is a change that helps a species become more suited to its environment, okay? It is a product of natural selection. So I put here question marks, some examples, right? So I'm sure I always sort of ask the class, can you think of some examples of adaptations, right? And so hopefully in your mind, you might be able to think of some examples of adaptations. I guess that I had a picture. I think there is a picture at one point somewhere in the book. I don't know why I always think of this example of a penguin. And maybe I think I did give this example in like chapter 1 when we sort of introduced evolution a little bit, right? Because it's one of the major themes or units of this textbook or of this course. But basically, if you think about the penguin, right, one of the adaptations that they have is this a behavioral adaptation or functional adaptation, I guess, however you want to term it, I guess, that they can actually slide on the ice, right? Because they have really short legs. They can't move very quickly, but if they slide on their bellies, they can move super quick, right? So that's more of a behavioral type of adaptation rather than something that you might see physically, okay? So that's my example. I'm sure you guys can come up with a bunch in your mind as well. Okay. Now, we're talking about natural selection, right? Darwin's theory of evolution, again, is based on natural selection. So I've been talking about that probably too much. But again, I really want you to understand what natural selection actually is. And so, sorry if things were a little redundant. There are a lot of words on these slides, right? Not as many figures as some of our other chapters because this is a different type of information here. Okay, so again, what I really want you to take away from what I've said so far is just understanding some of the ideas that were around during Darwin's time, okay, in terms of what people thought, and then really understanding the idea of natural selection, right? The idea of natural selection and adaptations, and how the environment influences what species will be successful, okay? So again, understanding that there are variations that are there first, and that then the environment will select for those variations that are most suitable to that environment, all right? The environment, I guess you can say it that way. The environment does not create change, right? Or create mutations or create variability. Variability is there first, all right? Okay, so moving on, talk a little bit about something. So we're talking about natural selection. We're going to mention artificial selection, okay? So in artificial selection, a breeder will choose which traits, right? A breeder, meaning usually a human, will choose which traits are, good for them, right? So they'll choose the traits to perpetuate. So they'll choose the traits that they want to stick around. And they'll basically select those plants or animals with those traits and choose those to reproduce, okay? So in terms of dog breeds, right? Dog breeds are a result of artificial selection, okay? So they all descended from the gray wolf. They began to be domesticated about 14,000 years ago. And basically, again, humans would select for those traits that they liked, and then breed those wolves with those traits. And over time, we end up with all these different breeds of dogs, right? These domesticated animals. And so there are pretty extreme phenotypic differences, right? So it says here, the wolves under domestication were separated from other wolves. So that's the first thing, right? So the wolves, some of these wolves were separated from the wild wolves. They became domesticated, right? So that's kind of the first sort of change that occurred. And then once you sort of had this group of domesticated wolves, right, then more and more artificial selection started to occur to then come up with all of these different types of breeds of dogs, okay? So for instance, right, you can think about, this is actually showing you the wolf, and then this is showing you a Boston Terrier and an Irish Wolfhound. Two totally different looking dogs, right? Dog breeds. And again, all descended from the wolf. And I'm sure you can think of many, many different types of dog breeds, and sort of think about how different these dog breeds look, and also how different they might behave, right? Depending on the breed. Okay, so that's artificial selection of animals. Also, we can think about artificial selection in plants. It's the same idea, right? You're going to pick plants with specific traits that you like, right? Maybe the taste, maybe the consistency, maybe how well they grow, what have you. And then you'll basically mate those or cause or yeah, I mean, I guess you can say mate. You're going to mate those, and basically you're going to induce those to reproduce, okay? Based on the traits that you want, not based on traits that the environment will select, okay? So it says here, the following vegetables are derived from a single species. So this single species is this wild mustard plant. Okay, so Chinese cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and kohlrabi are all derived from this wild mustard plant. So basically there were these wild mustard plant, right? Wild mustard plant started first, and then I guess you would see some variations within that wild mustard plant population. And basically, I guess we can say farmers would choose those mustard plants that had the sort of traits that they liked, and those were the ones that they would reproduce, okay, or grow more of. And that's how it led to the development of these different types of vegetables, okay? So it says Darwin described artificial selection as a model by which to understand natural selection, right? So this does. Artificial selection helps you understand how natural selection can occur, right? All right, so this is your example of the plants, right? As I said, these are all these three species are all derived from this wild mustard plant. Okay. So we've already kind of mentioned some of this. It says Darwin's natural selection hypothesis was really, a lot of it was based on the observations of the tortoises and the finches, like I said, on the Galapagos Islands. And I did mention these finches, and I told you, there was differences in the beak shape and the beak size. And so these are some of the differences that he saw. Okay. So it says each of the 13 species of the Galapagos finches has a beak adapted to a particular way of life. Okay. So in terms of, if we look at A here, this is a large ground dwelling finch. Okay. And that has a really heavy beak. Okay, so a heavy beak that's suited to a diet of large seeds. You can see it's really heavy beak here. If you look at the warbler finch, right, it's suited to feeding on insects. This is really small, pointy beak so that it can grab those insects. The cactus finch here, right, has sort of longer, kind of decurved beak. And basically it actually also has a split tongue that it can basically kind of poke his beak into the cactus and grab seeds from there. Okay. So again, these are 3 pictures showing you variations in the beaks of these finches that again, are suited to their environment. Okay. Particularly their food source here. Now, like I said, obviously, Darwin's work has been supported many times over by more present day scientists. Okay, an example of this is with Peter and Rosemary Grant. So their work observing natural selection, okay, of these finches on one of the islands in the Galapagos. Okay, and they noticed that the beak size of this particular type of species, the medium ground finch, will adapt to the weather. Okay. So and I'll show you a picture in a second, but this is kind of, I don't know, I sort of think of it as more short-term evolution, but the idea, again, it's displaying natural selection based on weather changes and kind of, again, being able to sort of observe this over a shorter period of time, okay? And there are lots of other examples of natural selection that we could show. I mean, obviously, these are just a super short list here. So, it says here, for one example, changes in the shells of marine snails due to hunting by crabs. Okay, so basically the patterns on those marine snail shells and now enabled them to be hidden, I guess, from the crabs, right? Beak length in this other type of bird here, the scarlet honeycreeper, due to a new food source. Again, so that's sort of along the same lines as the finches that we talked about. Industrial melanism. So this is the idea that these peppered moths, and actually we talk a little bit more about this sort of peppered moth example in the next chapter when we talk about population genetics a little bit and sort of smaller scale evolution, or evolution that's happening within a population. And the idea is when we saw the industrialization occur, right, the sort of sky, the atmosphere became more gray, and you saw a change in the color of these moths to match that sort of atmosphere to be able to hide from prey, from predators. Also, bacterial resistance to antibiotics. Okay, so kind of think about that. So if you think about that, how bacterial resistance to antibiotics relates to natural selection, right? Again, bacteria are living organisms, right? Think about a bacterial population, okay? There's going to be variation within that bacterial population, right? And so if there's an antibiotic that is introduced to this bacterial population to basically kill it off, right, so that it stops causing illness in your body, right, in a human, there may be bacterial individuals of that bacterial population that actually have a resistance to those antibiotics, right? And they'll survive. They won't be killed off by the antibiotic. Okay? And so that's a big problem, because now those bacteria that could survive that antibiotic, that have the resistance, right? They're going to survive, and they're going to produce more of those bacterial resistant they're going to produce more of those bacteria that are resistant to those antibiotics. And then what happens? We start to run out of antibiotics that can kill off these certain strains of bacteria. Okay, so super important. Again, the natural selection part of it, it doesn't really involve the human, right? Sometimes I ask this question on the exam, explain how bacterial resistance to antibiotics is a form of natural selection. Okay, and it really doesn't have to do with the human at all. It has to do with the bacterial population, right? Having genetic variation within that population, that some of those bacteria are actually able to be resistant to those antibiotics, and therefore will survive that environment with the antibiotic, and then we'll be able to produce more bacteria that are also resistant. Okay, so it really, again, doesn't really have anything to do with the human or kind of illness if you just think about the bacteria as well. What it does, it applies to us for sure, because again, if we're not able, if there are too many of these antibiotic resistant strain of bacteria around, it potentially can lead to serious disease that's untreatable. Okay. So anyway, just sort of a detour there, but I think it's kind of an interesting thing to think about in terms of natural selection. Okay, so again, it's kind of an example of the sort of, why do you care? Why should we talk about natural selection? It's sort of obvious that that's what's happening, right? And that's how species are adapted to the environment. But if you think about it kind of within that example of bacterial resistance, I think it makes it a little bit more interesting. Okay, so this goes back to, sorry, I got on a detour about bacteria and antibiotic resistance, but this goes back to that work, right, by Peter and Rosemary Grant, in terms of observing the beak depth, right, in this specific species here, that that beak depth will increase during dry years, right, and decrease during wet years, again, because of a change in the availability of that food source. Okay, so like I said, it's sort of shorter term sort of evolution, or shorter term natural selection, that you sort of, again, you can see that change just based on weather. Okay, so kind of super interesting here. This is giving an example of an adaptation that, again, is sort of, it's both a physical and a behavioral adaptation. So in this specific species of fly here, this species has a spot on its wing. The male has spots on its wing. Whereas if you look at this species here, this Drosophila melanogaster, right, does not have that spot. And basically, the males use these spots to attract females during their courtship dance. And so that's what separates these species apart. And so this species will only attract females of its own species, right? It's not gonna, and the Drosophila melanogaster that doesn't have the spots will not be able to attract females from this species. Okay, so an adaptation that sets those two species apart that has to do with courtship, right, or a mating ritual. Okay, so in terms of evidence for evolution, there's a lot, right? A lot of it has to do with fossils, okay, as you might imagine. Hopefully we know what a fossil is, right? Fossils are remains and traces of past life or any other direct evidence of past life, right? Like trails, footprints, or preserved droppings, anything like that is considered a fossil, okay? And that's our only record of life in the past, right? Are these fossil records, okay? And there are many scientists that spend their whole career searching for specific fossils and really and then gathering as much information as they can from those fossils, right? As much information as they can in terms of what the species was like when it was alive, right? What other species were then, or what ancestor that fossil is to sort of present day species, okay? So it tells us really a lot about evolution, obviously. It says they document a succession of life forms from simple to the more complex. It says sometimes the fossil record is complete enough to show descent from an ancestor, right? So again, like I said, you have to spend a lot of time studying those fossils and really paying attention to what they're telling you, okay? Now, there is something called a transitional fossil, okay? So these are sort of interesting. So it's a common ancestor for two different groups of organisms. So there's sort of these fossils that are in between two different groups of organisms. And so you find a fossil that looks like a little bit of both, okay? And so it says they allow us to they allow us to trace the descent of organisms. So these transitional fossils are pretty important. So one transitional fossil that has been found, and this was found in 2004, is this Tiktaalik rosé, okay? And it's called a fishapod. Okay, so basically it's a cross kind of between a fish and an amphibian, okay? So it's like a fish with legs, essentially. And so again, it provides evidence that, the early amphibians, if you look at, right? So if we're talking about moving from fish to the early amphibians, okay, you basically that fossil, that transitional fossil, provides that sort of link between those two different groups of organisms. Okay, so this is showing you a million years ago, right? So about 300 and I don't know, what is this? 300 and between 377 and 380 years ago, right? Versus up here with the early amphibian, about 365 or something like that, million years ago. Okay, so again, this transitional fossil is this sort of combination of this one in particular between a fish and an early amphibian. Okay, so again, provides that sort of link of this sort of descent, or this ancestral kind of lineage, right, between the fish moving to the early amphibian. And now there are many other types of transitional fossils that actually have been found, although I shouldn't say, I don't know if I should say many. So it's not like we find these all the time. I think they're sort of special fossils when you do find them, but there are other examples of transitional fossils. Okay, so I would say there's many others, but they're not as common as just finding, just sort of what we just call normal sort of fossils of just one specific species. But these sort of ones that provide this sort of link between two different groups of organisms are super important in terms of understanding evolution. Okay, one other thing to sort of mention, this is talking about the evolution of whales, right? So evidence that whales had terrestrial ancestors. So if we start here with this ancestral species here, this Ambulolectus, right? So about 50 million years ago, kind of two things that they're sort of focusing on here is the hind limbs, right? And then also where the nasal passage or nasal opening is located, okay? So here, this is a terrestrial organism, okay? Has, it's got 4 limbs here, okay? And now as you move into, so about now 10 million years later, right? What you start to notice here is that now this hind limb is totally retracted in here, but you can still see the remnants of that hind limb, okay? And also what you start to notice is that this nasal opening is starting to move back, okay? If we look at the modern day whale, there's no hind limbs anymore, right? The forelimbs have become, fins. You notice that there actually is still remnants, sort of, right? We call this sort of vestigial structure of the hind limb. These two bones are still sort of present, again, indicating that this modern day whale, right, descended from these species here. And now there are other species, in this evolutionary lineage. We're just sort of pointing out two major ones in terms of moving from a terrestrial organism to a complete, and whales are mammals that are marine, right, to a completely marine mammal. You notice too, again, remnants of the hind limb here, and then also that the nasal opening has moved, sort of completely back. When we think about the modern day whale and the blowhole, that's what we're talking about. But basically it started off here and basically moved back over time. Oopsie, wrong way. Okay, so again, just kind of tracing the lineage and obviously finding fossils of these organisms, super important to understand the evolution of the modern day whale, right? And again, you can do this with any, many different species, okay? Okay, when I mentioned and talked about Darwin a little bit, I talked about biogeography, right? And so it says biogeography is the study of the range and the distribution of plants and animals throughout the world, right? And so Darwin did this on his voyage. And so it says here, biogeographical distributions are consistent with the hypothesis that related forms of life evolved in one locale and then spread to other regions, okay? And so you would expect to see a different mix of plants and animals whenever geography would separate continents, right? Islands, seas, etc. You'll see this sort of different mix there, okay? So for example, a really good example of this is marsupials, okay? So marsupials are a type of mammal. So they're mammals in which females have this external body pouch, and basically their offspring continue development in that pouch, right? They need to complete their development outside of the placenta, or they don't even have a placenta, right? Outside of the mom, and they have to stay in this pouch for a certain amount of time. So these marsupials did evolve from egg-laying mammalian ancestors. Again, you only see them in certain areas of the world. Okay, so in South America and particularly Australia, right? Like everyone thinks about going to Australia to see kangaroos. And this is because Australia, well, at one point, right, the continents were together. And then once Australia separated out, these marsupials became isolated, okay? And therefore, they were able to sort of flourish in that area. If you didn't have this separation, those marsupials, unfortunately, would have been taken over by placental mammals, okay? And so that's what you saw in other regions. But because these or this group of mammals were separated and sort of isolated, they were able to survive, right, and reproduce and produce more species. Okay, but again, if Australia never was separated, you would have seen that these marsupials were taken over by the placental mammals, which have a advantage in terms of a developmental advantage, because development is completely finished inside, okay, the body. All right, so this is basically showing you here some examples of some different marsupials that you might see if you go to, Australia or South America. Okay, so this is actually showing you a kangaroo, and this kangaroo will resemble the placental Patagonian cavy of South America. We sort of showed you, I think I showed you a picture at the beginning of the lecture. Okay, so similar, right? But not not the same for sure. Okay, so again, you only see these marsupials in specific geographical areas. Okay, so example of the wombat here. Okay, sugar glider. All right. Now, some things to talk about. I kind of talked about or mentioned some of these things, but this is the last part of the chapter, but talks about, again, more sort of evidence of evolution, right? So what we were talking about before, particularly we're talking about fossil evidence first, right? Talked about transitional fossils. Then we talked about biogeographical evidence, meaning where you had certain groups separate off and become isolated because of geological or where you had geographical isolation, right? You see specific species that are present there. So that provides evidence of evolution. Okay. Also, there's anatomical evidence. So I sort of showed you this when we talked about the whale, right? This sort of this evidence of the hind limb that still exists in the modern day whale. So I'll mention that again, but that's a vestigial structure, right? If we talk about homologous structures, okay, so this says invertebrate forelimbs, okay? We use the term homologous structures in terms of the bones that are present in vertebrate forelimbs, okay? It says all contain the same sets of organized bones in similar ways, yet they are severely modified to meet various adaptive needs. But again, this suggests this similar descent, okay? So again, he interpreted this as support for common descent. Also, in embryological development, okay, all vertebrate embryos will have a post-anal tail, and they'll also have a paired pharyngeal throat pouches, which are supported by these arches. And so you see this in all vertebrate embryos. Now that changes over time, and so early embryos will look very similar. So like an early embryo of a turtle will look even similar to an early embryo of a human. I'm going to show you some pictures here. Okay, so in terms of homologous structures, right, they are inherited from a common ancestor. Okay, so if you think about, why do I not, oh yeah, I have a picture. Okay, so in terms of here, so we talk about homologous structures. So we said, forelimbs, vertebrate forelimbs, right? Even if you look at a wing of a bird, right, a bat, whale, cat, horse, human, these are the bones that make up these limbs. They are very similar, though the function of that limb may be really different, right? If we talk about an arm of a human, versus the four sort of flipper of a whale, super different. Wing of a bird, super different. But they contain the same basic bones, again, suggesting common descent. So when you talk about homologous structures, you're talking about common descent, right? All of these species descended from a common ancestor. That's what those homologous structures indicate, okay? Not to be confused with analogous structures. So these serve the same function, but they do not share a common ancestor, okay? So you can think about a wing of a bird and a wing of an insect. Similar function, but do not share a common ancestor. And in terms of, if you look at the structure is going to be different, okay? But the function may be the same, okay? Talked about vestigial structures. I mentioned that again. I went back and showed you that sort of example with the modern day whale evolution. But these are fully developed anatomical structures in one group of organisms, but now they're reduced or obsolete in similar groups. Usually, so if you think about human examples of this, right? The one you probably think of first is the tailbone, right? The coccyx. This is indication that our ancestors had tails. Okay, so that's why you have that tailbone. So that is an example of vestigial structure in humans. And like I said, I gave you that example in whales here. These bones that still exist that were there in the hind limb of that ancestor to the whale, that terrestrial ancestor. Okay, so I was mentioning the similarities of embryos. So like I said, if you look at a fish embryo, a salamander embryo, a human embryo, a chick embryo, these early embryos look very similar, okay? as you move along in development and you get to later stages, they're going to start to look a lot different. But again, this early, the early similarities that you see, again, suggest common descent. Okay. Okay. We also can talk about biochemical evidence, and actually, in recent times, because we have so much technology in terms of being able to analyze things biochemically or molecularly, right, in terms of like looking at DNA sequence and things like that, that has really helped us both categorize species, but also understand evolution, right? And so that's what this is talking about here. So it says all living organisms use the same basic biochemical molecules, okay? Use the same DNA triplet code, and I mentioned that in chapter 12. Utilize the same 20 amino acids in their proteins. That tells us a lot about evolution and, again, common descent, okay? So if you look at DNA sequence, right, between species, where you see a lot of similarities, that would suggest, again, more recent common descent. Where you see more different or more differences, that would suggest a more ancient ancestor, okay? This graph here is actually showing you differences between the number of amino acids in a particular protein. So this is a protein cytochrome C, okay? Human cytochrome C. This is actually a protein that's involved in the electron transport chain, okay, in the mitochondria. And if you look at differences in amino acids, again, a smaller difference will indicate a more recent sort of relationship, right? Ancestral relationship compared to more. So we can say things, we can say the human and the monkey are more related than the human and the yeast, right? Or the human and the moth. If we look at this biochemical evidence, there is lots of other evidence that would indicate this as well, but we can use biochemistry and, like I said, molecular biology to really understand evolution and to provide more evidence and more tools in terms of determining evolutionary relationships between different species. Okay, so again, you should be able to interpret this graph, right? This might be something, again, that I might put on the exam and ask you questions about, right? Here's this, look at this graph and tell me, which species is most related to humans based on this graph. Okay, so if you look at the monkey, the monkey cytochrome C is going to only differ in one amino acid, right? If we look at the pig, I don't know, maybe it's about 12 amino acids. The duck, I don't know, maybe 13. Okay, so you can see if you go down the yeast, the yeast cytochrome C is going to differ in about 50 amino acids compared to the human. Okay, so again, differences, biochemical differences will tell you a lot about evolutionary relationships. Okay, so another line of evidence. Also, another line of evidence, again, kind of going along with, again, molecular biology or DNA evidence, okay? There are specific genes that are involved in development, and there are many of them, okay? This group or family of genes called Hox genes are particularly involved in the development of the body plan of an animal, okay? And so it says all animals share a Hox gene common ancestor. And so the number and the type of these Hox genes will vary among different groups, okay? And but the point is that all organisms have some sort of variation of these Hox genes, right? So you see that this Hox gene, in terms of being involved in development, is conserved across all species, again, suggesting common descent. However, you'll have variations in these genes depending on what species you're talking about, okay? And again, these are responsible for differences in body plans, okay? So for example, if you talk about kind of, so there are Hox genes that are involved in controlling the number of vertebrae, okay? So again, it depends on how long or what time, how long these Hox genes are expressed during development, where they're expressed during development, that will help control the number and the type of vertebra, okay? So if you think about the difference between the spinal column of a chicken versus the spinal column of a snake, it is these Hox genes and the expression of these Hox genes that's responsible for those differences, okay? So it says simple changes in gene control have profound effects on that phenotype. So think about this, right? It's just a simple, subtle change in the timing of the expression of these Hox genes will will basically change the length of the spinal column from the length of a spinal column in a chicken versus a snake. Okay? Now, the last part of this chapter brings up some different criticisms that, people have brought up in terms of evolution, right? So it says, so one thing to state here is that evolution is not a hypothesis anymore. It is a great unifying theory of biology because there has been so much scientific evidence for evolution in terms of natural selection as described by Darwin. Okay. Now, some misconceptions or sort of criticisms of sort of evolution that have been expressed is that, or misconceptions, right? People think that when we talk about evolution, it's really a theory about how life originated. It's not, right? It's more about how we ended up with such a diverse group of species, right? And how they emerged, right? So there was already an origin in place, but you had the development of all these different species that we have, and how did that occur? It's not about the origin of life. So some people sort of confuse that and think that that's what evolution is, and that's not really what it is, right? There are also some people that believe there are no transitional fossils. I did talk to you about some of the transitional fossils that have been found, right? But there have been many, like I said, that have been unearthed. Okay, and there are probably a lot more that they haven't found. So they probably will find some more over time. And so again, misconception, because there actually have been transitional fossils that have been found. It says here, evolution proposes that life changed due to random events. Okay. The idea, right, that mutations occur randomly, right? The variation that's within a population or a species is random, but natural selection is not random, right? That environment is selecting for those traits that are most suitable to it. Also, evolution is not observable or testable. It's not really science. That's not true, right? It is observable. It is testable. We talked about it just within this sort of small framework of this chapter, but you can read, tons and tons of other work from scientists or evolutionary scientists that have, conducted experiments or made observations, scientific observations, and developed scientific hypotheses about evolution. Okay, this last part you don't need to worry about. This is just a excerpt that's in the chapter about the tree of life, and so it's a project, right? It's basically put in place to determine how all life is related and descended from a common ancestor. So it might be something interesting for you to read about. I'm not gonna, test you guys on it in the exam or anything like that, but it is in your textbook. And again, or you can look it up to read a little bit more about it. All right, thanks guys. That's it for chapter 15. Again, lengthy, but I think that in terms of the type of information that's presented in this chapter, very different than what we've been talking about so far this semester. And so this is us really switching gears, and really now getting into that evolution unit and evolution theme, to which we will then elaborate on in Bio 113 or Fundamentals 2, or if you take a general biology 2 course somewhere else. That's really what that focus starts off, and talking about evolution, different types of species, and then moving on from there. Okay, so we have one more chapter that will be covered on the final exam, and that is chapter 16. Okay, and that is, again, I think I mentioned this at one point, it is a chapter on the evolution within populations, so smaller scale evolution. All right, thank you.